I'm Jay Hughes. I'm the co-chair of Quiet Corner DSA, which is in Northeast Connecticut, and it is in fact a very quiet corner of Connecticut, one of the most conservative parts of the state. But Connecticut DSA is banging, Central Connecticut and Western Connecticut DSA. But out here, we've been doing a lot of political education stuff in order to keep our hand in. And I thought that this topic, both Sanwal and I are on the International Committee of DSA, and we both participate in the Asia subcommittee of that international committee. And in that subcommittee, as in apparently the other subcommittees as well, the different interpretations of what it means to be a socialist internationalist have been roiling some debate and discussion. And I thought since Jason is a proponent of, you wrote and proposed several resolutions for the National Convention this summer, which touched on this theme.
Not on my own by any means. It was put together by several members.
A joint effort. Okay, good.
Yeah.
And Dan has also been a long time activist, international socialist activist. Dan is current member of Solidarity, co-founder of Teamsters for a Democratic Union, co-editor of New Politics, and you can say more about yourself in a second. And Jason is author of a book about the neoliberal labor governments and the union response, and editor of a book, Rosa Luxemburg and Her Life and Legacy. And you're a adjunct professor in New York?
In the City University of New York system, political science.
Okay, good.
A lowly paid adjunct.
So I'll just say one bit more about my own interest in the topic. My college application essay back in 1979 was on the need for world government. And I've always had a passionate interest in world federalism, transnational institutions, and the possibilities of international cooperation. And over time, as I got involved in DSA, that kind of morphed into a social democratic world federalism, international trade agreements and ecological sustainability and things like that. A lot of those kinds of hopes got raised after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then dashed again with the various wars that we got involved in, and the increasing balkanization of the world into different kinds of illiberal nationalisms today. But my orientation has been challenged, and I'm very interested to hear from you guys by the various strands of Leninist thought that have come to us today and that are now a part of the broader DSA ideological family, some of which come from the Trotskyist tradition, which were critical of both Soviet and Chinese and other forms of authoritarian, whatever they were, as well as American imperialism. And that strain, of course, had a lot of influence on DSA through the DSOC, Michael Harrington line and people who were involved with that. The NAM had a different, the New American Movement had a more New Left approach to these kinds of questions, more third world solidarity, more anti-communism kind of approach. And I think we're still seeing the kind of working out of these various strains of what it means to be an internationalist and what the primary political responsibilities of international solidarity mean in the context of great power rivalries. So that was the kind of frame of what I wanted us to talk about today. So I'll turn it over. You guys have had a chance to figure out who was going to speak first. Was it Dan or Jason?
I think it's me.
Okay.
And let me just say a personal thing. I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. I've been an anti-war activist in every, against the United States in every conflict since then. I take it as the basic foundation that we're opposed to US imperialism. And I've never been a supporter of US intervention anywhere in any form. So I think that's important to state, because I find that there's some confusion in these things. Now, at the same time, I think it's useful to say, where did this idea that we now see of people who say, look, If you're against the United States, then you can't criticize any other government. You have to somehow, you're either on their side or you ignore their problems or you don't talk about them, because that will weaken the fight against the United States. And I think that's a mistake. And I think it's, where did this come from? This notion that you have to support one camp, an anti-imperialist camp against the United States, and maybe there's a few US allies, Western Europe, Saudi Arabia, Israel, that are considered, those are the bad countries, and the rest of the world really, because it's always contesting the United States, is good. And I think that, I think this began really with the Soviet Union and with the revolution in Russia, and working class people had, after 1917, for a few years anyway, they had a place they could say the workers took power. And that's what we've been fighting for. And that's our camp. We're on the side of Russia. We're on the side of Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union. And then even though the Soviet Union began to, very early on, I think by the mid-20s, the Soviets disappear. That is, the Workers' Council disappear, democracy disappears, the trade unions no longer exist. There's only one political party, the Bolshevik or Communist Party. And yet there's still the idea, and then Stalin comes to power and you really have a one person, and there's still the idea of, in the minds of many people, you have to support Russia. That's our camp. Now, it's a big problem because as internationalists, from the very beginning of Marxism, the idea was you want to support movements for democracy and for socialism, movements against racism or sexism, movements for women's liberation, movements for gay liberation, wherever they appear, movements to protect the environment, wherever they appear. But once you have that position, then it becomes, and I think what happened was that evolved over time, even though communism fell, even though the Soviet Union fell apart, there was still the notion you had to support the Soviet Union. And then people said, well, so that Putin is still an opponent of the United States, so we should still support Putin because he's fighting the United States. We should still support China because China is an opponent of the United States. We should, et cetera, Iran and so on. And I think those become obstacles to saying, wait a second, we're international solidarity of working people, the oppressed, and so on. And we're for democracy everywhere. So I think that poses a real problem. I think that's sort of the origin of this in a very quick shorthand. I mean, we could take a week to discuss that, but maybe I should stop there and let's see what Jason wanted to say.
Okay. I will admit I have been, or I was, surprised that in recent years there has been a sort of revival of what Dan and I have called campism, or I think more accurately, second campism, particularly when it is from self-described Marxist-Leninists who identify with some wing of what used to be the official communist movement, either pro-Russia or pro-China, because 10 years ago, the dominant strain on the left was basically anarchist. And the anarchist left has traditionally been for the overthrow of every state in the world, regardless, of what it called itself. And that's the traditional Marxist view as well, and one I think we should still hold to, which, and take workers of the world unite very seriously. I would argue that regardless of what these states call themselves or what governments call themselves, either anti-imperialist, socialist, whatever, one has to look at deeds and not words, and you find that all of these governments repress independent trade unions, throw socialists which are critical of the government or the party state into prison. That even happens in Cuba, which is supposedly the most democratic of the official communist states, and of course, it is nowhere near as repressive as various governments that the U.S. Has supported. Still, the uncritical attitude and lack of research into these issues is problematic to me. Just as I think it was wrong for any socialists in the United States to act as, and perhaps I'm overstating, cheerleaders for Western social democracy, even in its more radical phase, or seemingly radical phase, in the 1970s, and certainly not when you had so many social democratic parties taking the side of the United States and the West during the Cold War being pro-NATO and Atlanticist, as the term was. I don't see why we should be cheerleaders from afar of any state, any government, regardless of what it calls itself, because when one looks at the details, they are all hostile to their own domestic working classes. And a number of them, you can, I think, call them, in the case of someplace like Iran, and it would take too long to explain precisely what this means. I think Iran, and while of course we have to oppose US economic sanctions on Iran, Iran is a sort of regional sub-imperialist power, or trying to be. And where I think a lot of this comes from, and I could be wrong, I understand the sort of reflexive habit of assuming that anything that the mainstream corporate media in the United States and the global North says about a country must be a lie. And when you think of all the outright lies that Judith Miller of the New York Times told about the existence or likelihood of the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, I can understand that. Well, that was an outright lie. It's been definitively proven that this was an outright lie. Therefore, anything that what we call the bourgeois media says about China, Vietnam, anything they say about the war in Syria, and so on, must also be false. But that is not necessarily the case, and there are any number of independent socialist, Marxist, anarchist sources that you can point to, including people from those countries, who point out, no, they are repressive, they are anti-working class, period. And it goes so far that there is so-called alternative media, which often claims to be left-wing, but I don't see media like Gray Zone or Mint Press as left-wing in any real sense. Not only do they deny that China is suppressing its ethnic and religious minorities, like the Uyghurs, they deny the existence of forced labor camps. It's all Western bourgeois propaganda. Never mind that there are major global fashion brands that have profited from forced Uyghur labor, and these are Western corporations. You know, they openly say they support the coup in Myanmar. I don't see what's so socialist about doing that. I mean, I could go on, but it's very surprising to me that this type of thought has not only found a resurgence, but now has a place in certain elements of DSA. Sometimes it's very ideologically motivated and very, very hardcore, and sometimes it's just, well, the US and the global North governments play terrible roles in the world, which they do. It doesn't follow that any government or state that the US doesn't get along with, therefore must play a positive role in the world.
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to invite Sanwal to jump in at any point. Sanwal's from Pakistan and has a keen interest in the South Asian perspective, which I think is somewhat aside from some of the debates that are usually had about Latin America or Eastern Europe. But I wanted to ask you guys a question about when we go around in the International Committee, we ask often, why are you here? What are you interested in? And about half of the folks say anti-imperialism. And what they appear to mean by it is that because the US is the hegemonic military and economic power, although I would argue a declining hegemon, that opposition to US imperialism or US hegemony is the sole responsibility of socialists. And therefore, any criticisms that we might evince of countries, as you said, Dan, as you both said, of countries that, like China, would be aiding the imperialist cause. And so a part of you had made a reference, Jason, to the fact that it was strictly a second campus position, because the third campus position is the third camp being neither the Eastern Socialist Bloc or the West. We're a third camp that we're opposed to both of those blocs. Today, there isn't really another bloc out there. There are just a bunch of other countries. But is it in your mind still true that that the U.S. hegemony, U.S. imperialism, whatever you want to call it, is the principal responsibility for us in terms of foreign policy?
I think it's certainly it's our principal responsibility that we should oppose the United States government. But I also think that if we looked back to the time of Marx and Engels, or to the time of Lenin, Trotsky, and Rosa Luxemburg, and so on, there were always imperialism was never a single player game. Even when there was one dominant power, even though Great Britain was the world's dominant power for 100 years, even so, everyone recognized, well, yes, Great Britain is a big, powerful empire, but there's also Germany, as Germany became a state, right? There's also, of course, France was also a huge, powerful empire. And so I think one of the most important things is to say, yes, the United States has been the dominant power. It is militarily far superior. But if you look at China, it's almost as if the Chinese leaders are trying to define what is imperialism. Massive investment abroad, huge programs around the world in foreign investment, taking advantages of countries, sending Chinese workers in, sending Chinese industry in, establishing a greater and greater economic sway of China. And at the same time, China is expanding, for example, the classic example, and I think it's correct to look at the South China Sea, where China has created islands in the South China Sea, where it is seen as threatening countries from the Philippines, Indonesia, and so on. People in that part of the world know that China is an imperial power. People who are from Eastern Europe know that Russia is an imperial power. Talk to somebody from Poland or the Ukraine or Lithuania, where people know that Russia is an imperial power, and certainly we've had the attack. Russia under Putin, for the first time since World War II, we had the seizure of territory from another country when Russia seized Crimea. Now, there's clearly the West is interested in the Ukraine. It's true, but this doesn't diminish the imperial role. So I think there's two things. Just to wind this up, two things. One is we have to recognize the United States is not the only imperial power. There are many others. And Jason mentioned some of them are sort of smaller regional powers, like Iran. They're not major, but they're important in their region. And the other thing is we have to somehow temper our internationalism, our anti-imperialism with our internationalism. That is, when you have a country like Russia that puts cultural radicals like Pussy Riot in prison, that poisons, assassinates journalists and opposition candidates and so on, we have to stand with those people who are protesting against that. Now, are the people who protest, are they all have pure socialist politics? Practically none of them do. Socialism is given a horrible name by countries like Russia and China, and we could add others in other hemispheres. But socialism is given a bad name. They're not socialists. Some of them are Democrats, not Democratic Party, they don't want capitalism necessarily. They want democratic rights. They want the right to be gay. They want the right to be a woman, they want the right to be a worker, have the right to strike and so on. So we have to temper our imperialism with our internationalism. It's very important to place ourselves on the sides of people everywhere who stand and fight for democracy, and some of them do fight for socialism. That is, even in these societies where socialism has a bad name because of what so-called socialism did, there are people there fighting for democracy and socialism, and we have to find a way to support and work with them. And that's what our role should be.
Yeah, for me, I think internationalism is more so than trying to latch yourself onto states, because I don't necessarily see either a socialist state or a capitalist state as something that I want to die arguing about. For me, it is more interesting. I think we need to have more nuanced opinion. Like I think somebody in chat mentioned that we need to defend, that is, verbally or in conversation, the gains that are made by socialist revolutions such as China, Cuba, all these places, and recognize them. Because I think oftentimes people who support these revolutions get really mad when because they think that we're denigrating what they have achieved. I don't think any of us are saying that China uplifting 800 million people out of poverty is anything to sneeze at. I mean, if lifting people out of poverty were the only metric to use for capitalism versus socialism, socialism won. So for me, it's internationalism, because I come from a country where in Pakistan, I come from Pakistan, where there was Pakistan never had a socialist movement. Pakistan had a communist movement. It was a very militant movement. It was so. But now if I tell you I'm from Pakistan, you will think of Pakistan certain things. You will think it's extremist, Taliban, military. These are probably top of the 3 or 5 or 6 things that you'll think. And they're all correct. But in the 1960s, the communist movement was so popular and powerful there that when it came to 1970, the election, there were 3 main parties running, and they were all socialist. And they were all fighting for who was more socialist. That was their fight. Now, if you look at sort of this, what I call, Western left internationalism, there are often ideas like, well, we will get people elected as our presidents or PMs, will take over the foreign office, and then we will do internationalism. And to me, that is just a ridiculous idea. If you think you're going to take over the State Department in the US and do internationalism, you're delusional. No. That's never going to happen. Now, how do we do internationalism is then the question. For me, it's always about when I came to the US, I did not know too much about Latin America. It's something I had to teach myself. Now, the problem became that what I was learning about Latin America was amazing from a socialist, a left perspective, but there weren't enough what I felt like media outlets or some kind of organizations that were in direct dialogue with these movements. Right? I mean, we sit in the US and we and I think DSA is doing a great job in doing these things, building links with, for example, the landless workers movement in Brazil and other movements across the world. So I think for us to do internationalism, we have to stop having a patriarchal understanding of internationalism, where we go from like, oh, because we are the enlightened ones, we are from the rich countries, so we have a special place to go and do internationalism for you. So I think for us to have any kind of democratic, any internationalism that is going to be worth fighting for, is to form actual linkages, actually engage with the movements that are on the ground. And for that, we need media. We need proper media. We need media that engages in actual debates beyond whether Democratic Party is better than the Republican Party is not. It is in certain ways. Let's just get over that debate. Now let's talk about how can we actually build internationalist perspectives beyond just rhetoric, and also build institutions which are actually, like, I think that Progressive International is one great institution that has been doing some good work, is actually building linkages with movements across the world and trying to bring them to a common table, like what the Second and the Third International was trying to do, what the Comintern was trying to do.
Let me press you on what you said about the State Department, though, because we are, as a political organization, we aspire to gain power within the American state, right? We're trying to get congressmen elected. We tried to get a president elected. Okay, I know you guys are trots, so
No,
you're
no,
not,
not correct either.
okay. Well, I'm a social democrat, and that's the goal. You know, Bernie would have been great for me, and I would have wanted
Bernie would have been great.
Yeah, and I would have wanted Bernie to appoint left-minded people to the State Department, and to try to carry out whatever we could through the State Department. And the State Department already has, under the Democrats, a liberal internationalist, at least rhetoric, that we support gay rights, we support democracy.
Not liberal in the left liberal sense.
Okay, so but you understand where I'm going. If our goal isn't to influence American foreign policy through those kinds of avenues, if you think it's just impossible, then it's only the bottom up stuff that you think we should do, right?
No, I think we need to have, I'm always trying to have this conversation in my head, as well as like, do I want a movement? Do I want a figurehead? I think if I had to choose between one or the other, I would prefer a movement, because I think there's a reason for that. So if we have a proper socialist, workers, oppressed people movement in America, just like actually grassroots movement, bottom up movement, then leaders are going to spout out from there anyway. And when those come up, we can take those opportunities. Like Bernie came up in 2016, we were not ready for it. We didn't have a movement. Bernie came at a really opportune time. He won a lot. In 2020, I think Bernie didn't do as well, but I think we are stronger as a movement. We have more chances in 2024 to go up again, and this time maybe actually win. Now, when it comes to the question of State Department, I think if Bernie had been elected, I would have loved it. But I think Bernie's State Department would have been able to shift in some very meaningful way the balance of power. Now that means that there would have been possibility. I don't know if Amazon or Shell or all these other companies would have allowed this to happen. But I think he would have been able to say, okay, Brazil, I think in 2008 or 9, they tried to form a regional currency, right? When the Obama State Department came down really hard on that. We're like, what do you think? You guys think you're independent states? You're not. You depend on the dollar. So you have to depend on us. Right. So I think there's some things where, and it's a question that I've thought about a lot, but I don't know the answer to it, because I've never seen it happen, because the most progressive, so-called progressive state presidents and their state departments have been awful. Like LBJ started the Vietnam War. FDR created the tools of imperialism called the IMF and the World Bank. So hard for me to guess how progressive a US State Department can be. I think that gives us a shot of having people who we can get there to pass some things. But I think that comes back to the question of the movement. We build up a movement, the next Bernie who comes along, so that when he does take over or she does take over, that we actually have people who can take those places within the State Department and actually direct policies, rather than just have one Secretary of State and the rest of the State Department is still working against that person. So for me, I think it is a question, it is an experiment that we would have to see, but I don't have an answer for that right now. I don't know how progressive a US State Department can be.
I'll jump in. First, just so I remember it, I want to recommend everything that Ashley Smith of Vermont DSA has written on imperialism, on contemporary imperialism, you can find his writings in truthout.org. You can find them in Jacobin, New Politics, Tempest, other publications. Secondly, I know that there are some people who either use the word imperialism to only refer to military intervention by the United States or some other country of the global north, or by countries which are, and this goes back to Lenin's pamphlet on imperialism, dominated by finance capital. I think we need a broader definition of imperialism, and within that, we need to distinguish between forms of imperialism. We live under here what I guess is still called advanced capitalism, which is imperialist. It doesn't follow that less advanced capitalism is not necessarily imperialist. By definition, the evil in advanced capitalism is capitalism, not advanced. And here I am going to sound like a Trotskyist, I guess, but Trotsky was accurate here. Capitalism develops unevenly on a global scale. And there's a tendency for the unevenness to increase and to compound itself. So some countries become sites for modern infrastructure and advanced industries, services, major finance capital, the headquarters of transnational corporations, etc. Others are stuck with few industries and are operated by low-wage labor with low investment and general poverty. So capitalism in its very essence is, as I think we all know, a system of very ruthless competition. And to put it a bit crudely, the rich and strong do down the poor and the weak. And the wealthier capitalist states, the banks, the transnational corporations based in these states dominate over the poorer countries. And that is imperialism. But that is not confined to the United States. It is not confined to the so-called West. And even if the US is imperialist power number one, it doesn't follow that it's the only imperialist power. It doesn't follow that only the so-called West is imperialist. And one thing that Ashley stresses is that while the US remains top dog amongst imperialist powers, we really do live, I think, in a multipolar imperialist world again. It doesn't mean, and people of whatever political strength think that China is going to overtake the United States, whatever that might mean. I don't believe that to be possible, but we are seeing, I think, a sort of Cold War, and I think this will continue under the Biden administration, between China and the US, despite the intertwining of our national economies. And we have to be opposed to both states in that conflict. Karl Liebknecht, who was one of the founders of the German Communist Party, coined the famous phrase, "The main enemy is at home." And I want to argue that is true in every country in the world. Our main enemy as workers and as socialists is our ruling class. The main enemy of the Chinese working class and peasantry is their working class, and so on and so forth.
I didn't mean to cast aspersions on you, Dan, if you want to clarify your
No, you didn't cast
ideology.
me. I didn't feel, I just don't like to be labeled. That's, if I'm going to label, I'll label myself. I come broadly out of a trend that is called third camp socialism. And it were people who broke with Trotsky, because Trotsky continued to defend the Soviet Union after the rise of Stalin, and felt that the Soviet Union I don't think his tradition was the correct one on those questions. I can't go into it here. I thought that I'm going to resend a question that somebody else put up, Mary C. I just put it there in the chat. I thought she asked a very interesting question here. She points out something that's interesting. She points out that the people in Vietnam, of course, are opposed to Chinese imperialism and very worried about it. They've had to deal with it for centuries. Before China was a capitalist, and after it was capitalist, and after it was communist. So, and I think she raises a very important and difficult question here. That is, how do we stand on the side of the people of Vietnam and stand on the side of the people of China against the Chinese government, but not stand with the United States? We don't want to support a Cold War. We don't want to support a military buildup by the United States. And I think that it has to do with exactly what Sanwal was talking about. That is, solidarity between people across borders, international solidarity. For example, China had many years recently, back in the 2000s, the earlier 2000s, say 10, 15, 20 years ago, China had huge battles of peasants fighting against losing their land. Their land was being taken away in China. Workers were organizing, trying to create independent unions. There were many strikes. There were just thousands of events going on in China. And it was very difficult to find a way to support them, but we should have supported them, not the Chinese government. We should have supported, we socialists, not the United States, not with the US government. We should have supported them. And I think that is a difficult process. Regarding the State Department, I don't think that you can take over that. I don't think socialists can take over this government and use it. This government is a government, I believe, of the banks, of the corporations, of the military, of the biggest media firms. It is a government of the ruling class. And so I don't think we can use that government. Even if we brought to power, I would have liked to see Bernie Sanders elected, not because I thought he could have changed the course of the government completely, but I think because he would have been a hell of a lot better and it would have allowed space for movements. And on the movement thing, just one more word. For 20 years, from 1994 to 2014, I worked with the United Electrical Workers, edited a paper for them called Mexican Labor News and Analysis, worked with them in cross-border solidarity, tried to work with unions in Mexico and the United States and to connect them. And that is a way that you can build real international solidarity. Do I think the United States ought to do something in Mexico? No. What the United States has done in Mexico has always been a disaster. But we socialists can do something. We people who are involved in labor and social movements, we can do something. So I agree with the emphasis Sanwal puts on movements. I also do think we have to build political parties to struggle for power. But you can't, but this, I do not believe this state is usable by us.
Paul Garver asks a related question, which is about sanctions. So you're skeptical of the idea that US foreign policy could be moved in an anti-imperialist direction. I understand why you're skeptical. Paul is proposing a much more limited thing, which is, should American socialists get behind the idea of sanctions? And there are some in the International Committee who say that sanctions on regimes like Myanmar, or Russia for that matter, or Iran, are always going to be an exercise of imperialist power, always going to be harmful to people, et cetera, et cetera. And so they find themselves in the position of arguing against sanctions, and in the same way that big corporations would, that the big corporations would say, well, we're going to liberalize them by having penetration of international capital into these regimes or something. So is sanctions something we could get behind? Do you have an opinion about that?
You going, Jason?
Well, I mean, I wish I was more expert. It's been hard for me lately to keep up with the news on everything. But go ahead, Sanwal.
Yeah, I can say, because so for the Myanmar special, I am broadly against sanctions, and I'm gonna answer Myanmar question as well. Because if you look at sanctions in any country, the ruling people who you're trying to target like you can take from Iraq to Afghanistan to whichever state you want to sanction that has been sanctioned by the U.S. The people who are ruling that country, their quality of life doesn't decrease. They're hardly ever overthrown. So what you're trying to do is, it's just, I mean, you think Hamid Karzai's life has been really altered by anything, or people who are running Iraq, their life has been really altered by anything, or Syria's,
so that's an efficacy question, right? That's not that
but,
we're imperialist.
But I do support, like for Chevron, I think that's an independent country. It has profit motive that we can exploit. If we should launch vigorous campaigns attacking Chevron in the US media, in the Western media, because that's where they care about. We should attack their bottom line. We should make it an anathema for them to attach themselves to the Myanmar's dictatorship. Now, I don't think that we should be, I'm very much against using US state power to come down on states through sanctions, because I think generally, historically, it's been used against socialists, at least in all the 1900s. And whenever we strengthen these regimes, whenever we strengthen sanctioning powers, we're essentially, creating the ropes that we're going to hang ourselves on. But I like these. In each of these countries, you have corporations who are corporations of rich people who are, strengthening up these demagogues. And I think I'm fully in support of attacking those. I'm fully in support of attacking people like the people at the top, not the people at the bottom. So I think sanctions attacks the people at the bottom, not at the top. So I think we should have we should at least, if socialists believe in a better world, we should have the imagination enough to come up with better ways of attacking people who we are really trying to attack.
On the sanctions, I think it's one of the things is it seems usually so problematic. For example, I spent some time in Nicaragua in 2013. I wrote a book about it, published in 2016, and Nicaragua had become a police state. I was a person who went to Nicaragua, supported the Nicaraguan Revolution, went there in the early 80s, carried some supplies there, and I believe that was an important struggle against U.S. imperialism. But it changed, and it became a dictatorship now under Ortega, where Ortega allied himself with business, he lied himself with the United States, he lied himself with the Catholic Church. Recently, the United States got mad at him under Trump, so then he turned to Russia. But it doesn't. That is the question of sanctions in Nicaragua, as it came up in 2018 after the Nicaraguan government killed many, I don't know, a few hundred students and suppressed many others, and there was a lot of violence by the government in Nicaragua. And there was a call for sanctions, including by people in Nicaragua. But the people in Nicaragua calling for sanctions were people who they were people interested in bringing to power a certain business group in Nicaragua. And so supporting those sanctions seemed to me to be a way of trying, if you took that position, one would end up supporting US liberal capitalist interest with a certain ruling elite in Nicaragua. So I think it often seems that way. It often seems very problematic. Though at times one does say, gee, it would be great if we could bring enough pressure on these other countries in some way. But usually this doesn't come from a movement from below in the United States demanding that. It's usually come from some element in the ruling elite. And I wish Paul Garver were on this conversation to talk about it, because I respect his opinion and I know he knows a lot about it.
Paul is in favor of sanctions on Myanmar, for the record.
Yes. Right.
You brought up Latin America, and I think one of the conversants here on the chat wanted us to address the question of Venezuela. We have an international DSA delegation that went to Peru, and hopefully the left candidate there has won now, and they were election monitors. They were really a solidarity delegation. But we also sent that delegation to Venezuela. And I think it's safe to say that there was no interest on their part in meeting with the socialist opposition in Venezuela, of which there is a socialist opposition. Do you want to address those kinds of questions? I mean, this is a different question than the imperialism one, because I don't think anyone would argue that Venezuela is imperialist, but...
No, but the U.S. is imperialist, and the U.S. has been imperialist regarding Venezuela. And one, of course, wants to support the Venezuelan people against U.S. imperialism. And many of us, I think, at the time of Chavez, Hugo Chavez, we wanted, Hugo Chavez was, you know, I didn't have any faith that a military guy coming to power, leading a particular political party that he was creating from above. I don't think that was a good model, but it seemed that we should be on the side of him against the United States, and also because he opened spaces in Venezuela for other developments. But then the economic problems of Venezuela, which had to do with the world oil prices and had to do with mismanagement of the Venezuelan economy, and had to do with something that people have called the Boli bourgeoisie, the Bolivarian bourgeoisie, meaning the bourgeoisie that those people who became wealthy within the Hugo Chavez apparatus or became involved. By the time Maduro comes to power, the Maduro government is now a very authoritarian government. And as you said, there is a socialist opposition. There has been always opposition of trade unionists and socialists in Venezuela. It is certainly a big mistake for people from the United States, many of whom I think probably haven't been to Venezuela before, may not know the country's history, don't know the political parties there, may not speak Spanish, and you go to some other country. It's very important to listen. And it's important to go to that country and send a delegation there to say, we want to listen. We want to hear from everyone who's here, including, like, we don't support Guaido or the right-wing parties in a place like that. We're absolutely opposed to Guaido trying to make himself president by blowing himself up, you know, through, I'm now president, you know, we were not in favor of that sort of thing, but you should talk to everyone in the spectrum. You should find out what they're thinking, what they're doing. What is this country about? Especially talking to working class people, poor people, the people of color in Venezuela who suffer terribly from the racism of the elite in Venezuela and so on. So I think that the DSA having delegations going places, that's great. Going with their opinions and their minds made up, and failing to talk to everyone, and certainly failing to talk to the democratic or socialist left in those countries, is a terrible failure.
All I want to say about sanctions is that I don't think that socialists, certainly not in the global north, should be advocating sanctions. And I'll just leave it at that. We have no real control over what, you know, the Biden administration is going to do vis-a-vis sanctions. And, you know, to me, it's like advocating US military intervention. We have no control over what that administration is going to do. So we should not do that, because, you know, we might, you know, regardless if when bourgeois governments do good things, it's, you know, essentially by accident, so to speak. So I would not, you know, well, I guess I've made my point. I had another point I wanted to make, but now I can't remember what it was. All right, Jay can start up again, and I'll remember what it is that I wanted to say.
Well, several of the resolutions at the summer convention and some of the resolutions that you put forward, Jason, and by the way, are the resolutions that made it into the summer convention, did they start with the ones that you were putting forward? Did yours make it through the process?
They made it through, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they are a continuing attempt to formalize the International Committee's work. And I see them reflecting what is a pervasive problem, I think, in DSA, is that because we're not a democratic centralist organization with, you know, 100% cadre who are listening carefully for every nuance of what the Central Committee says, we have all of these different fractions and interest groups and, you know, mutual aid and everybody. And some of the things reflect anarchist politics and some of the things reflect Leninist politics. And in the International Committee, we have people with a lot of different kinds of politics. And in the past, you would say, oh, you're going to be going to France. Yeah, go ahead and talk to people on DSA's behalf. Now we're trying to formalize that and say, what does it mean for us to have a political line on things and to send people to represent those lines? Is that what you see some of these formalization of the International Committee resolutions representing?
I'm not expert enough on what DSA's International Committee used to do. If it's just a matter of observation, fine. But when you send, when DSA would send somebody to France or what have you, but what was the point of doing that exactly? Simply to observe the class struggle in France? Was it a matter of Mitterrand said he would do X, but is doing Y? I don't know.
Well, I mentioned France for a reason, was because I went on a speaking gig in France 5 years ago, and it was sponsored by the U.S. Embassy. And I was driven in a U.S. Embassy car to a meeting that they arranged with the French Socialist Party, because I wanted to talk to them about DSA and how DSA could be in solidarity with the French Socialist Party. So, but that was okay back then. And now we have this much larger and now formalizing organization. And I think it's appropriate, because we need to have a political vision for what those party-to-party contacts should be. And let me also add to that, I would like to see us recreate an international, maybe not the Socialist International, but an international where we have sister parties in all the countries.
No, I think I think you need a real, here I'm going to sound like a Trotskyist again. Socialism in one country is impossible. A classless society within national boundaries is not achievable. So you do need an international of mass parties that aren't just saying nice things about each other and singing solidarity forever at international meetings, but are actually conducting internationally coordinated campaigns in concert with one another, primarily outside of the legislature. And now I remember what I wanted to say. I think it is far more important for socialists to win office in legislatures rather than in executive offices. You can act more as an opposition. You can act more freely as a tribune for socialism in the legislature rather than in executive office. Because when you're in executive office, you really are governing capitalist society. That may not be what you want to do, but that's what you're doing. And even in an extremely wealthy country like the United States, even a Sanders administration with all his good intentions, Sanders probably would have ended up implementing policies that he never wanted to implement or watering down his program because the US capitalist class won't let him do otherwise, even if 90,000 socialists in DSA are out there supporting him, marching the street, what have you. I think Sanders would have found himself constrained, to say the least, regardless of his best intentions as US president. There would have been real hostility to him, not just the State Department, but the Pentagon, the Fed, etc. I do believe that with sufficient social unrest, but it takes a lot of social unrest, you can get radical reform. I don't think a Sanders presidency by itself would have been enough to make that social unrest happen, especially when we have a labor movement that is hardly a movement and which was not supporting Sanders. But that's different than the whole campus in question.
Yeah, for the sanctions part, I should make a clarification. I was reading the chat. I am against sanctions by states against states. I am not against, something like BDS. I'm a pretty ardent supporter of the BDS movement and the sanctions movement that was led against apartheid South Africa. Now, coming to the question of DSA having different tendencies, I think it's actually good that we have tendencies because within the U.S. electoral system, it's an uphill battle to form a party. I think, and was this in reference to something I was listening to a talk by Vijay Prashad, who was talking about why the Communist Party still exists in India, and he said, you need to have various parties of the left in a country because one party can't capture every struggle. Before the Russian Revolution, there were various parties, technically parties organizing within the Bolshevik Party. the same way, I think DSA is a good way for us to organize on different things that anarchists do and Marxists do, and immigrants are organizing and workers are organizing, but they're organizing within this umbrella place. I don't think a lot of us are realizing how important that is, that we are bringing all these struggles together every 2 years and debating on these things in a major way. I mean, we do it every week in various ways, but it is very important that we have various quote parties of the left in the US. And I think at the moment, at least, this is the best way that I see of doing it. Of course, I support a workers' party in the US. And I would want a workers' party. I would be, less depressed engaging in electoralism if there was a workers' party in the US. I would still be depressed because I don't believe in electoralism. But it is, I'm actually very happy that, the DSA exists. There are different, essentially parties of the left within the DSA who are organizing on different things, and we are then figuring out how to move forward in that struggle instead of just 50 people organizing immigrants and then 50 people organizing workers and then nothing happened, because that's not enough.
Sanwal, you mentioned the Progressive International. I'm also a big fan, but Yanis Varoufakis has been criticized as not having much of a social base. His efforts to intervene in European politics have garnered, marginal support. But I think the vision of what he's, the work that the Progressive International, it's not just Yanis now, but it's the whole organization. The vision of what they've been putting out is very good. And it's a step to the left of the Socialist International for sure, or the Progressive Alliance, which is the other European Socialist International that got organized. But in our work, there are a group of. Go ahead, Jason.
I think the Democratic Party is part of the Progressive Alliance, like the Democratic Party leadership. I might be wrong, but I remember reading that.
No, they are. But in the Asian work that Sanwal and I are doing, there is an alliance that's affiliated with the Progressive Alliance in Europe called Social Democratic Asia, and it involves parties from Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand and all across the Asia Pacific. I would like to see that swath of folks be brought together with the more Marxist-oriented parties and groups that the Progressive International and some of the groups to their left represent. And I don't know how to engage in that project, but it's the kind of vision, it's the kind of internationalization of what we're doing in DSA to bring together all these different strains of the left.
I think that we're at kind of a moment here. There was, for let's say the last 15 years or so, there was an attempt to create what we call new broad parties of the left. You might even call them new left social democratic parties. The bloc of the left in Portugal is one example. There was Podemos in Spain. People would have said perhaps De Linke in Germany, the new anti-capitalist party in France, and so on. And PSOL, the Party of Socialism and Liberation in Brazil. And it seemed that PSOL, setting that PSOL aside, it seems that the European ones have all become very frustrated and are not, that attempt is now over. That didn't work. And so I think if one is thinking about how to bring together new forces for some new international, we're at a moment where it's harder than ever to identify those forces, in part, I think, because of the rise of the far right in Europe, because of the failure of this attempt at new left parties in Europe. It's a very difficult. In Brazil, I think it's heartening that PSOL, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, has done well. But the DSA leadership that we have today, and I think some of those who may become leaders after this convention, would like to just orient to the Workers' Party, the PT. And the Workers' Party was very problematic in many ways, and PSOL was a left-wing split from it. And this is exactly the kind of thing. We ought to at least have relations with both. And certainly we ought to have relations with PSOL. I would prefer relations just with PSOL, I think, but certainly both. The problems of, there was corruption in the PT that had to do with Lula, long before this whole thing with the car wash investigation, as was called Lava Jato. He was known to deliver a bag of money to the other legislators every month, the mensalao, in order to stay in power. And I think it's hard for people to look at that and say, well, there's a problem here. We want to be on the.
But Dan, don't we need to follow the people? I mean, PSOL gets 2% of the vote, and the PT gets 40% of the vote. So
yeah.
I'm not always for following the people, or I wouldn't be in this tiny socialist organization with 100,000. Most of the people are following Biden or Trump,
Yeah, and also I think for something like you're talking about Lula. I love Lula. I think he overall was great. But talking about the corruption, the kind of stuff that you're talking about, just going and handing off bags, I think that is unfortunately of the post-colonial states where the democratic institutions are not as strong. It's just a reality. It sucks. In Pakistan, I know like there is not a left party at the moment. There is a liberal democratic party who used to be a socialist party. But if, let's say, there was magically a left-wing party that rises up tomorrow and like 4 years later they win the National Assembly, they would probably have to do something like this to even pass anything moderate, because they're literal feudal lords who are elected to the National Assembly, and they have a certain tendency. They're going to stay there. So you would end up with a place where you would need, it sucks. It really sucks. But if in Pakistan, for example, like in Pakistan, there has never been proper agricultural reform. And unless you do that, you can never move that country forward. And if a left party wins in like 4 years, they would have to do shenanigans like this. We might hate it, but that's their reality. And, that we have to, and we don't have to be okay with it, but I think we have to at least understand it.
We're not supposed to push this too much past an hour, but I wanted to ask one final question, then we can have a round to close. But I want to return to my interest in transnational institutions. I remember a conversation with Joe Schwartz that I had 35 years ago, where he said that his vision of socialist internationalism was the Trotskyification of Keynes, by which he meant creating transnational organizations that could accomplish social democratic, redistributive, and regulative tasks of capitalism at a transnational level. And similarly with international security arrangements and with global climate change arrangements, we need these kinds of transnational institutions. I know that you too, Dan and Jason, have a more bottom-up perspective of what the task of a socialist should be in the current period. But shouldn't we also have a vision of what kinds of new transnational institutions we want to create, how we want to expand international police powers to enforce human rights, to make the UN Declaration of Human Rights actual legislation instead of just wishful thinking? Isn't that part of our vision as well?
You want to go first, Dan?
No. Let's let Sanwal go first.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I fully support bottom-up stuff, but I think at some point, I have more anarchist leanings than anything. If I were to classify myself as an anarcho-communist, so I'm definitely opposed to states and everything. But in the moment, it would be ridiculous of me to be like, no, I'm only going to work towards abolishing the state. I have to, work within the current system that exists. And I think we should have things like Progressive International. I think they do a good job of being bottom up to a certain degree. Like I know they have a delegation from Pakistan, which had like a few parties in it that joined them, and those parties themselves were pretty bottom up, not parties and groups. And then those groups elected their leader there. So I think that's a pretty good example of having a bottom-up organization that is socialist in its orientation, without it being too controlled at the top and them telling, oh, well, Pakistan can have this delegate, India can have this delegate, Brazil can have that delegate. I think as long as we're making sure that not too much power gets concentrated at the top, because we still at the end of the day have to make decisions, so we have to see some executive control. But I think as long as it's decided ahead of time, I don't see any problem.
I find it far more important. In relation to what Jason said, and I remember Joe Schwartz making that phrase too. I don't see what John Maynard Keynes has to do with it specifically, but I think the only way that you're going to get the type of robust social democratic reform or radical reform or non-reformist reform or whatever you want to call it is through mass radical left parties working together across national boundaries. And that probably will happen outside of parliaments and Congress first, and also within parliamentary oppositions, rather than such parties winning government, because I suspect for the foreseeable future, they won't be able to win government. They will be the militant, disloyal opposition. And also, you know, I take the impossibility of socialism in one country very seriously. You know, if somehow or other the working class took power in a single country, there wouldn't even need to be military intervention the way there was in Russia. All there would need to be is economic sanctions, and that you know, that state would fall apart rather quickly. Imagine, you know, Britain, which imports most of its food still, cut that off, and no more British worker state. You know, it'll last a few months, and that's it. And also a real international alliance of the entire labor movement across the world. I know these are tall orders. Socialism is a tall order, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Right? It's necessary for the survival of most of the human race. Otherwise, humanity in general is going to hell in a handbasket. Those are the facts as I see them. But you know, that which is not easily achievable is still, I think, objectively necessary. And you know, maybe it's possible for a genuine far left, democratic far left party to win government in some places. They're still going to be very constrained by international capital without major social unrest in that particular country and surrounding countries, and without material support from abroad. And I will say about DSA, I'm glad, the term Big Tent has become annoying to me. I'm glad we're a pluralistic organization. We certainly don't need theoretical uniformity. Otherwise, we become a sect. We don't need people to mouth opinions that they don't actually have and don't believe. But I do think that this organization really needs more of a set of common principles. We need something of and the International Socialist Organization, with which I had both agreements and disagreements, had a where we stand bunch of paragraphs. And that should be on the front page of the DSA website. We need to have, at the very least, explicitly stated democratic, small d, libertarian, small l, class struggle principles. And, you know, with the working class, always. With any existing state, no.
I think I'm probably saying what others have said, but I think we have to do the grassroots, rank and file, from the bottom, organizing both in our own country and support people in other countries doing it, and look for ways to connect it, which is pretty difficult. And I also agree with what you said, that yes, of course, we need to have a vision. We have to think about the international vision. We have the models of the three internationals, each one a little different: a trade union international, a socialist party international, and an international that, you know, briefly considered itself a revolutionary international. But I think I don't mean overly pessimistic, but this is I see some people writing in the margin over here in the chat. It's hard to read or respond to these things about revolution. Well, I think we all want to see a revolution. A revolution is when we overturn everything. And when I used to think, when I gave a talk when I was running for office as a socialist candidate, I would say, when the woman who's raising a couple of kids, when we can take care of her, when she can take care of herself with us, that is the revolution. That's the overturning of the society. Thinking of my mother, a working class woman raising a couple of kids. That's what we have to do. Overturn, bring to the top of the society those at the bottom. At the moment, we are going backwards. We are being pushed back by the forces of the right on a global scale. And so it's not that we don't care about a revolution, but I think we have to think about what are the connections that we can make? Who can we work with? And to examine that carefully and be willing to talk, to be willing to go and listen to people, to go return to the DSA delegation and DSA members, be willing to listen to what people have to say and to try to understand them. I appreciate a lot the opportunity to be here. Thanks for organizing this.
And here, thanks very much, Jay.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for helping to facilitate, Sanwal. And thanks for all the participants. There was quite a bit of conversation in the chat. And we will put the recording of this up on the Quiet Corner YouTube channel. So you'll have a chance to share it with folks if you want to. Thanks again for joining us tonight, guys.
Thank you. Solidarity.
Solidarity.
All right. Solidarity.